So it's a pleasure being here tonight. We had a nice long chat last week about this, and so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. The book is gripping, it's informative, it's entertaining. Now a lot of this has to do with the main character, Prez. He's intelligent, he's athletic, a great lover, and a talented fighter. If we hadn't just met last week, I might have thought you were writing this about me, but clearly you weren't. But I kid. But I want to know why, in the book, Prez is seen as so dangerous throughout the book, and so are those around him. And one of the biggest questions I was left after reading this is why is it that educated and enlightened black men and black people are deemed to be such a threat? Like, why were Prez and his compatriots so persecuted?
See, knowledge is a powerful thing, and the one thing that the slave master always tried to keep from the slave was knowledge, because once you learn something, once you possess knowledge, no one can use your lack of knowledge as a weapon against you. So when Prez and his group of friends were growing up, their parents had a concept of their blackness as something that was ugly. They had a concept of Africa and Africans as being a jungle full of uneducated beasts who deserved the treatment that they were getting. And so along comes Prez and his generation, and lo and behold, they could read, they could think, and they could communicate with each other in a situation where they didn't allow themselves to be afraid. So you take knowledge and you take the complete absence of fear, and you have a human being who is going to be a human being and not an object of someone's oppression. So you mentioned, why was Prez and his buddies, why were they dangerous? Well, to them they weren't. And to their community they weren't. But to the white power structure and the forces that were designed to protect the privilege of the white power structure, they were dangerous because they were afraid these kids are going to get out of control. They're no longer going to be satisfied with the station in life that we have assigned them to. They aren't going to be 20th century slaves anymore. And so this is why, when they weren't necessarily afraid of the main character's parents' generation, the ones that had served in the Second World War. And the ones, because they had served in the Second World War, there was this misconception that they were obedient to the point where they were just a step or two away from being slaves. So along comes Prez's generation, and they don't have the same respect for example, police officers that the parents had. They came up fighting in the street, so as far as they were concerned, you have 2 arms and 2 legs, just like I have, so what's the big deal? I can read, you can read, so what's the big deal?
Exactly, and I like your point about the folks having come back from World War II, of course, because they were fighting to liberate other people while they weren't liberated at home, right? So the black vets coming home didn't get to benefit from that freedom.
Exactly, and in the book, actually, one of the characters in the book, his father is alcoholic, and he had served in the Second World War, and He's the character in the book. I don't know how many people have actually read the book. I don't want to give anything away, but there's a scene in the book where this fellow is drunk. It's the middle of the night, and he's drunk. And he's out in the street, and he hurls bricks and stuff through the convenience store that's owned by Hungarian Jews who had just come over. And there's a complicated history there because oftentimes these people would treat the neighborhood kids very, very poorly. And so he's drunk out of his mind. He throws the stuff through the glass, and basically he's saying, look, I was in Europe fighting for you guys, and now I come back here and you treat me like garbage, and everybody's treating me like garbage, and it just made him crazy.
And that's such a powerful part of the book, right? Because he's angry at their prosperity. He's angry at his place in the world and his inability to benefit and get material goods like the Hungarians had. He's an alcoholic. They've got a store. They're seemingly doing well. I think one of the most beautiful parts of that book is the police are going to arrive, and very quickly community members rush out into the streets, and they get him in the house before the cops are able to get him and do who knows what they would do to him, right? Obviously, the police feature throughout this book. Prez has run-ins with the cops from the time he's a young child, physical as well as verbal, but he's abused, from a very young age, and then almost killed by the police on more than one occasion. How does the role that the police play in the lives of African Americans and Black people change throughout the course of the book, and how do you think it's evolved even since then? We go through the 1950s into the 1960s. The police are playing a key role in cracking down on the Black liberation movement, but just on Black freedom and Black movement generally. Again, how did that progress throughout this period, and how does that relate to what we see now?
Well, it's actually more complicated than it appears on the surface, okay? First of all, you have a situation where when you consider the origin of the police forces in North America, in the States, the origin of the police are the slave patrols. Before there were police forces in any municipality, in any county, in any city in the South, they had slave patrols. In some places, it was mandatory by law that young whites and other whites who were not of the elite class, not of the planter class, they had a responsibility by statute or by law to form a patrol, and they would ride around from plantation to plantation, making sure that they kept the slaves under control. And if they encountered a slave on the road, they were entitled and empowered to stop this slave and demand to see a pass, because you couldn't get off the plantation if you didn't have a pass. If this sounds like modern racial profiling, well, yeah, there you go. So in the South, this is the origin of the police forces. They were set up specifically to control the slaves. So you have this contradiction between the police and African Americans at the inception of the creation of police forces. The other origin of the police, of course, is Sir Robert Peel, the British, he was prime minister at one point.
Politician.
Yeah, he's a politician, and we live in Peel region in Mississauga. In Montreal, there's Peel Street.
Of course.
And they're named after this fellow, Sir Robert Peel, who created the Metropolitan London Police Force. And he created it not to protect the people of London, but only to protect the financial district in London. So what you're getting here is that the police in our time were created to protect privilege, not to protect people. Now, this is not to say that the police are the enemy, because if you really look at it, the police were drawn from the same class. They come from the working class. I mean, does anybody know of any rich person like Bill Gates who's a police officer? Anybody from that class who's a police officer? So, in my way of thinking, the police are sort of a way to keep the working class divided and fighting amongst each other, because the people that they're policing comes from the same class that the police comes from. But with respects to your question, and with respects to the character in the book, and with respects to what I was trying to portray, is that the contradiction between protecting privilege and the giving out of violence by the protectors of privilege says one thing. It says that everything under capitalism is an object. It's a commodity. It's got to have some kind of value, unless you're the one that's determining what the value is. Right? So a slave was just property.
I was about to say, when you take that back to the initial formation of the police, of course, you can look at slavery as being key to the roots of modern capitalism.
Well, slavery occurred because there was a transition going on worldwide from feudalism. Feudalism was dissipating, and capitalism was beginning. This economy in which commodities were being created. It was a very different thing, which is weird because Canada has a queen and monarchy is from feudalism. So you take the situation where feudalism is dissipating and they need slaves to create surplus value.
And so I like that you use the word surplus value, because if you look now, especially too, at so much of what is happening, you've got these huge pockets of America, of Canada, where you've got groups of people who are unemployed who are exactly that surplus value, and that's where the police are focusing so much of their attention today. One of the other things that came out of Prez's experiences with the police and those of other characters was just like the anger and hostility that came from the way that they were treated, right? And one character in the book I felt was able to tone down Prez's anger like nobody else, and that was Master Flower. Master Flower is this extremely interesting character. He looks so vulnerable because he's disabled, missing a limb. He's clearly not vulnerable in other ways because he's a master of the martial arts. He seems very quiet, but he's very connected. Connected to the powers that be, perhaps too connected. What was the impetus for Master Flower? Why that character?
Well, you've touched on part of it. Because somebody looks vulnerable, we should not assume that they are. We shouldn't judge people by how they appear. And the people that actually look the most vulnerable to us may actually be the people that are the strongest among us. But we won't know this if we approach them from the perspective that they are somehow below us because of their disability or because of what we perceive as their vulnerability.
And he says that's why he's never bothered by anyone in the park. He's Filipino as well, right? So people think he's a foreigner, the police think he's handicapped, and so no one bothers him because he looks so unassuming.
He also looked in a manner that people could not, like, categorize, like, what is he? You know, so this speaks to what we call race, which is not a real thing. But Master Flowers, he had dark skin, he had eyes that were slanted, he was smallish, but he was still strong. So the powers that be, the police, they didn't know what he was. To Prez and his friends, he was interesting. So here's something else. This generation coming up were extremely curious and bright enough not to accept stereotypes, not to accept answers that they had been given in school, to understand that there's something else other than what I'm being told. There's something else other than what I'm being shown. So in Prez's case, the character, he was a street fighter. Mm-hmm. So of course he's fascinated by when he meets this little hobbled man in the park who is like faster than he was. And he knew these tricks. One of Prez's friends was a big guy, a big tank of a guy, a big armadillo of a guy, and Master Flowers just flips him over onto the ground with little effort. So of course, Prez is interested in this, you know. I can kick butt with a little effort, so I'm gonna learn from this guy.
He was a good fighter, Prez and Master Flowers.
Yeah, but Master Flowers was a source of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And the kind of wisdom that compels one to treasure life. And though Prez and his friends, they were too young, they would have been too young and too immature to express it the way that I just expressed it, but they just had this sense. They had this sense like, this guy is special because there's something in life that's special, and we don't exactly know what it is, but this guy is on to something.
And that value of life, like that came through in the book a number of times. Like anytime someone was injured or killed, it was like you know, what gives? Like that's another life taken so thoughtlessly, right? Now, Master Flowers seemed like he was maybe connected to the feds himself. So along with the police, of course, we've got the federal government weaved throughout this book, doing what the federal government did in this time, which was kind of infiltrate and try to divide and conquer. Was Master Flowers a mole?
Are you supposed to ask me that, or like people supposed to read that and they're supposed to ask that? And
Okay, we'll leave that one. We'll leave that one open.
Okay, so this is how I'm going to deal with that tricky slide question. Don't try that again.
I've been warned.
He was Filipino, and there was a Filipino resistance movement to American occupation in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There's a guerrilla movement called the Hook Guerrilla Movement. Now, many of those Filipino people were allowed to immigrate to the States if they proved themselves to be of service to the Americans, especially the U.S. Marines. So, based on Master Flowers' age, you can guess that it would have been his parents that would have had some kind of interaction with the occupying force. So the reader is left to wonder if you, now that I've told you all this, you know about the Hook movement, that's H-U-K, look it up. The reader is left to wonder, okay, so Master Flowers, he's a master of various styles of Kung Fu. We know he's training Secret Service.
Exactly.
How did he get this connection? Were they driving past the park one day and looked over and said, who is that funny looking guy? What's he doing? We like him, we're going to get to train him. Or was it his parents that were serving some sort of useful function to the American occupying force? And they were able to come up to the States, and that's how he got to the States. So.
Because I conflict Master Flowers with the professor, right? Professor McKay. So Master Flowers we're not sure about. McKay's, there's no question that he's dirty.
That he's what?
Dirty.
Conflicted.
He's most definitely
Conflicted, but again, he's based on a real individual that I knew, but his behavior and the way he was, you can consider him also to be a composite for a whole group of African Americans, male and female, gay and straight, who were being used either knowingly or unknowingly by the United States government.
The government.
Yeah.
And I say dirty, I should have given him a little more credit, because he is clearly conflicted and he acts in ways that show that internal struggle, especially towards the end of the book. But like I found him, he was a challenging character, shall I say, a difficult character. The federal government obviously plays, as I've said, a key role here. One of the other things I found so interesting about the book and about not so much the characters but the groups was that like these groups of young men and young women, but especially the young men, if we were to look at them today and think about what they were doing, and I imagine the same was the case then, look a lot like what we would call street gangs. Was that terminology used to describe these groups of people then, whether that be in Washington or in Chicago especially at that point in time?
Well, certainly the authorities called them street gangs.
And would they have seen themselves as street
No.
gangs?
No.
So what did they see themselves as?
Clubs, friends, not even crews. Like, we didn't even use the word crew, just a bunch of guys that hung out together. And then later on as one group started really getting into it with another group, and the whole issue of territory came up, then guys decided, okay, like, we're going to be this group, and we're going to name ourselves this, and this is our turf, and so forth and so on. But with respects to this negative image, this negative idea that young African Americans hanging out together, grouping themselves together, has with respect to larger society, that's just prejudice. That's just a form of racism, because just going back again to slavery, it was one of the things that would get a slave whipped was if 2 or 3 of them were hanging out together and they weren't supposed to be hanging out together, and you were hardly ever supposed to be hanging out together if you weren't doing 2 things, working or in church. Everything else, the paddy rollers, which is what the slave patrols were called, paddy rollers, they would come along on their horses and dispense their violence, and they were entitled, and I use that word accurately, with sorrow. They were entitled to discipline a slave from beating the living shit out of the individual to killing that individual. And that means everything in between. What are you looking at? Take your knife and stick it in the eye. So these things actually happen when you read narratives, which you can in the library or online. There are slave narratives of how slaves were actually treated in real life, in real time, and it is shocking.
That doesn't sound all that different from how Pres and some of his friends were treated by the police, though, in the 1950s and the 1960s.
Yeah, but see, when he came along and his group came along, they refused to be afraid anymore, like I said earlier. Mm-hmm. This guy, he might be 6 feet, but he's got 2 arms and 2 legs like I do. And the line of demarcation was, don't touch me. This is my body, and it's holy, it's sanctimonious, and that's where we drew the line, right there. And it was the fact that during slavery, slaves had no control over what was going to happen to their body whatsoever. Their bodies didn't belong to them. And I guess a lot of women feel that way, no matter what ethnic group they're from. So that's why there's always been a link between the African American liberation movement and the women's liberation movement, going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, the guy who I'm named after.
Let's run with that a little bit. The next question I was going to ask you was about coalition building amongst different groups of black people at that time, right? One of the things that Pres seems to be able to do is mediate, right? Mediate disputes between people, mediate disputes between groups. So, like, how important was that coalition building to the work that was being done at that time, and what did it look like?
It was survival. Basically, it was survival because early on, you understood that, look, I can't be fighting this guy, and he can't be fighting me, because we have a common enemy that wants to kill both of us. So we're not getting anywhere. We're not solving our problems. I'm going to jump ahead a bit. So in the 50s, late 50s and early 60s, because of the civil rights movement, and because of people like Dr. Martin Luther King and because of people like Malcolm X, there was this rise in political consciousness throughout the whole community. When I was a little boy, a slur that you used to hurl at an African American was to actually call that person black, believe it or not. I remember my grandmother, who could pass for white, arguing with my mother, who was beautifully dark, and calling her "you old black thing," right? Okay, so that was an insult that you would hurl at another black. Actually, that was the worst thing that you could say to another African American, was to call that person black. So that's when I'm a little boy. I'm 3, 4, 5 years old, and I'm hearing this. Now, here's how complex we are. My brother is only 18 months younger than me. He's younger. So I'm emphasizing that because you would think that if there's an older sibling and a younger sibling, the younger sibling has a propensity to be progressive because he's coming along after. So like the older one is the one that's catching all of the old stuff, and the younger one is coming along and he's sort of looking and he's got the opportunity to reject or not. But for us, it was the opposite. Okay, so when I'm a little boy and I'm hearing this black stuff, I'm thinking like there's something wrong with this. You know, I'm looking at my mother, I'm saying, hey, damn, she's good looking. And I'm looking at my grandmother and I'm saying, she's not too good looking here, you know? And so I thought like, there's no correlation between skin color and attractiveness, number one. But it did not imbue me with a sense of inferiority, but it did my brother, and he's, like I said, younger. Mm-hmm. So jump ahead to the late 50s, early 60s, when African Americans started to reject any sort of notion that the way they looked was ugly.
Start wearing afros.
That's right. That's right.
The shikis.
And it's so confusing because on my birth certificate in the space for race, there's the letter C, believe it or not.
Colored?
Yeah. And in my brother's, it's the righteous letter N for Negro, right? Now, I know this sounds weird to people these days, but to graduate from being an old black thing, or worse, the N-word, to being a proper Negro, that was a big deal.
That was seen as progress.
That was a big deal. That was like, yes, I'm a Negro, so you respect me and you treat me just like I'm a full human being. So, full human being. That's what the struggle was really all about. Because the N-word is not a full human being. To be an old black thing is not a full human being, even though we righteously turned that around very quick with I'm black and I'm proud.
So this is obviously a struggle for personhood and humanness. Again, going back to slavery, you couldn't hold other people as property, right? So black people had to be, Africans had to be dehumanized. I want to move back and ahead. The book starts in Montreal, goes to the United States, ends in Montreal again. So Prez lives, as you have, as a black man on both sides of the border. What are the nuances of race and of being a black man in Canada vis-a-vis the United States? How are things different? How are they similar? For Prez or for yourself? Small question.
Not much. You're right.
Not much difference?
No.
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 So how does, like our ideas of multiculturalism, though, factor into this, and openness and tolerance?
That term, multiculturalism, that posits a supreme culture, that posits a master culture, that posits a culture that all the other cultures revolve around, so I reject that term, multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. You follow me?
Yep. And especially, multiculturalism came at a key moment in the struggle between English and French in this country, right? At the same time that people of color were coming. So it kind of just obscures kind of a lot of difference, and I think to an extent helps us mask much of the intolerance that exists in this country.
I love Canada. I think it's a great country. It's a complicated country. I mean, there are two classes of citizens here. Not too many people know that. I mean, if you weren't born here, you have to take a citizenship oath, and you have to pledge fealty to the Queen of England, which makes you effectively a subject of the Queen, and not only that, a member of the church, the Anglican Church, because the Queen is the head of the Anglican Church. So when you pledge fealty to her, you're also pledging fealty to the Anglican Church. But if you're born here, you don't need to do that. So it's two different groups of citizens here. And I'm very interested in this because, And I can feel my wife's eyes on me because, you know, she wants me to take that citizenship oath no matter what I have to say, right?
Well, you wouldn't be the only person that's been involved in the struggle for black liberation that hasn't gotten citizenship because they didn't want to take that oath, right? There are a number of leaders of Toronto's black communities that have decided not to do that because for exactly that reason, right? Because they don't want to swear allegiance to the Queen and by extension, I've learned today, to the church. We're getting close to the end of like our discussion before we open things up. I want to ask you, is there anything that any part of the story that you left out of the book? Anything that you wish you'd written or you'd written differently?
Are you supposed to ask me that?
Of course I am. It's like when you get the audio book, right? You always get like a 15-minute at the end, additional material.
Well, I will say this. I'm writing a sequel,
Okay.
so I'm not going to answer your question.
So we'll be back here in 2022?
No, you're going to have to wait.